They said she could make a man forget his God in a single glance. By the time the first body was found, the church bells in St. Landry Parish had already stopped ringing because the priest who rang them was among the dead. The year was 1854, and two of Louisiana's oldest plantation families were coming apart at the seams. Not from war or plague or debt, but from one woman whose name appears in slave ledgers written in trembling hands. Her name was Mary Ann, age 26, purchased for $800 at a private sale near Opelousas. The papers list her skills as domestic service, needlework, French instruction. But that last word, asterisk, asterisk instruction, asterisk, asterisk, is where the records turn strange. Because Marian could read and write both French and Latin, and no one could explain how. The clerk who handled her transfer noted that she carried a small leather book, which she refused to surrender. He described her eyes as unnatural in calmness, her voice soothing to the point of unease. 3 months after she arrived at Belle Rive Plantation, the master's wife stopped eating. The overseer began seeing figures in his quarters that no one else could see, and the young heir, barely 20, was found one morning sitting in the cane field, smiling, murmuring her name, with both wrists opened by his own hand. The newspapers called it fever. The neighbors whispered witchcraft. But the letters, buried in private family archives and later sealed by court order, tell another story. One that doesn't fit inside the language of superstition or sin. Because Marian wasn't just intelligent, she was strategic. She studied people, watched them, then dismantled their certainties like a craftsman taking apart a clock. She'd been sold twice before, each time under a special restriction that the buyer take her beyond parish limits. That phrase appears again and again in Southern records, always followed by a trail of deaths and debts. And yet, the most chilling part isn't what she did. It's how she did it, without ever raising her voice, without lifting a hand in violence. Louisiana's archives describe her as possessed of strange influence over men and women alike. But history erased what that influence truly was. Until now, because the documents recently uncovered in a courthouse vault, letters, confessions, and sealed depositions, reveal what really happened when Marianne arrived at Belle Rive, and how she used knowledge, not sorcery, to destroy two dynasties from within. Belle Rive sat 30 miles north of New Orleans, surrounded by cane fields that whispered at night like something alive. The plantation belonged to the Delacroix family, descended from French nobility and proud of it. They had wealth, land, and the illusion that refinement could protect them from corruption. But power has its own gravity, and when Marianne arrived through the back gate that summer, something in that house began to tilt. She did not beg. She did not weep. When the overseer shouted, she merely lowered her gaze, not in submission, but in calculation. Those who saw her that first day said she looked as if she were listening to something only she could hear. Within a week, she knew the rhythm of the house, who drank, who prayed, who whispered, and who listened. Madame Delacroix, pale and brittle from illness, grew fond of her immediately. "She speaks like an educated lady," she told her husband. "Keep her close." And so Marianne was brought into the main house, a decision that would undo them all. In the months that followed, she became indispensable. She played the piano when the mistress was too weak, read aloud from French novels, and tended to her late into the night. Her presence soothed the household, yet the air grew heavier, the servants quieter, the master restless. It began with small things. A misplaced account ledger, A letter is missing from a desk. Then came the fevered dreams, servants waking with scratches they could not explain. The old housekeeper swore she heard Mary Ann whispering in French to someone unseen, her tone soft, almost affectionate. But what frightened them most was how the mistress changed. Madame Delacroix, once devout, began asking questions about sin, freedom, and the soul's ownership. Questions she had never dared speak aloud. Marian never contradicted her. She merely asked more. The master noticed his wife's new defiance, her refusal to attend Sunday Mass, her sudden distrust of him. By autumn, he had taken to drinking at his desk, muttering that the house no longer felt his own. No one could prove anything, but everyone knew the change began the day Marianne arrived. And when the mistress was found dead in her bed that winter, her face peaceful, her hands folded over a rosary with every bead snapped, the parish priest wrote one word in his journal beside her name: influence. By the time the summer heat settled over St. Landry Parish, the Devereux estate had become a place of quiet paranoia. Curtains stayed drawn even at noon. The mirrors, once symbols of French vanity, had been removed, every one of them, by the order of the master's wife, Eleanor. She said reflections disturb her sleep, but the truth was simpler and far more dangerous. Eleanor had caught sight of someone in one of those mirrors, a woman who looked exactly like her, only darker. The servants whispered it was Celeste. They said when Eleanor descended the staircase, she would sometimes meet her eyes in the hall mirror, and that for a moment, she couldn't tell who was who. Celeste had become more than a servant. She was the phantom thread sewn into the family's very skin. She nursed the children. She dressed the mistress. She stood beside the master when he entertained guests, her presence soft, obedient, magnetic. Yet the men who met her gaze never forgot it. Something in it moved between worship and warning. When the mirrors disappeared, so did the last barrier between illusion and truth. People noticed small things first. The baby cried when touched by the mistress, but not by Celeste. The master began to spend nights away from his room. Eleanor started praying aloud in languages she didn't understand. And yet Celeste remained silent, her eyes calm, her steps measured, as if she knew this was all part of something long planned. One night, the field hands claimed they saw two women walking across the garden at midnight, both in white gowns, both barefoot, both carrying the same lantern. When they reached the magnolia tree, one of them vanished. The other dropped the lantern and walked back alone. By morning, Eleanor's hands were shaking. She ordered the priest from Opelousas to cleanse the home with salt and scripture. But when he stepped inside, he paused. The walls smelled faintly of jasmine and blood. And in the nursery, where the children slept, a mirror was hanging again. Not one that the family had owned. Something older, something with a pulse. By autumn, the Devereux estate had become the talk of every table from Baton Rouge to New Orleans. Not because of the harvest, not because of the master's declining fortunes, but because of what people began to see. The first rumors came from the seamstress, a freedwoman who was brought in from the next parish to tailor new gowns for Eleanor. She said she saw two gowns measured from the same form, the same shoulders, the same waist, but for different women. When she mentioned this, she was told to keep her mouth shut. 2 days later, her house burned down. Then came the preacher's wife. She confessed, in tears, that she had caught the master at the riverbank, kneeling, whispering to someone hidden behind the cypress roots. The light of his lantern fell on a woman's face, and the skin of that face was not his wife's. By winter, Celeste's name had become a ghost word, something people spoke only when no one else was listening. They said she was not born, but conjured, that she had learned to pray backward, that she could make a man forget his mother's face, his God's voice, even his own reflection. The scandal erupted when Eleanor's brother arrived from New Orleans, a loud man, a gambler, the kind who thought sin could be swallowed with whiskey. Within a week, he stopped eating. By the second week, he was gone, vanished into the bayou after a storm. Only his boots were found, sitting neatly at the edge of the water, facing the house. Eleanor began wearing black, though no one had died officially. She stopped attending Massachusetts, and when she walked the veranda, her eyes followed something no one else could see. Celeste, meanwhile, carried herself with strange serenity. The house slaves whispered that she hummed lullabies to the walls, that she spoke to her reflection when no one else was in the room, and that sometimes, late at night, two voices answer her, one pleading, one calm. The master grew gaunt. His hands trembled during supper. He stopped calling Celeste by name and began addressing her only as you. Something had shifted in him, a sickness without fever, a longing that hollowed the man, but kept him alive enough to suffer. And when Eleanor's youngest child fell ill, coughing blood, whispering Celeste's name in his sleep, the town finally spoke what everyone already knew. Whatever Celeste was, she was no longer just a woman. She was an inheritance. The river began to swell 3 days before the boy died. At first, it was just rain, soft, persistent, unthreatening. But by the second night, the bayou had turned restless, bloated with mud and memory. The frogs went silent. The crickets stopped singing. And those who had lived long enough in Louisiana knew, when the water begins to rise without sound, something buried is trying to surface. Eleanor sat beside her son's bed, clutching his small, fevered hand. He was burning, his eyes glassy, whispering words that didn't belong to him. Sometimes in French, sometimes in an older language. Elle vient, he kept saying. She's coming. Celeste was nowhere to be seen that evening. The servants said she had gone to fetch herbs from the riverbank, but the master hadn't given her permission. And by dusk, when thunder began to crawl across the sky, the family's fear had become something close to worship. They found her after midnight, standing knee-deep in the river, her white dress soaked, her hands lifted toward the storm. Lightning flashed, and for a moment, the field hands swore the water around her was glowing, not from the sky, but from beneath. When they dragged her back to the house, her eyes were open, but she wasn't breathing. The master slapped her until her chest convulsed, and she gasped like someone returning from far away. That same hour, the boy died. Eleanor's scream carried into the storm. The priest arrived the next morning, but he refused to enter the house. He said the water line had risen around the Devereux estate, as if the river itself was circling the property. There are places, he said, where the earth remembers sin. The child's coffin was sealed before sunset, but when it was carried to the family plot, the men swore they heard something tapping from inside. Celeste did not attend the burial. She was locked in the cellar, for her own safety, the master said. Yet each night afterward, the servants claimed they could hear her voice drifting through the floorboards, low and rhythmic, like she was singing to someone who wasn't gone, only sleeping. By the time the river receded, half the house had fallen ill. Eleanor stopped speaking altogether. The mirrors somehow had returned, and in each one, Celeste's reflection smiled, even when her real face did not. The cellar of the Devereux estate had always been a place for wine, grain, and punishment. But after Celeste was locked inside, it began to breathe. The servants heard it first, a faint, rhythmic pulse that came from beneath the floorboards, like the earth itself was exhaling through the cracks. Some said it was the humidity. Others said it was the rats. But one of the older maids, a woman who remembered the African coast, crossed herself and whispered, "No, the ground's remembering her." 3 nights after Celeste's confinement, the master went down alone. He took a lantern and a pistol, telling Eleanor he only meant to confront her, to make her confess what she'd done to their child. He didn't come back until dawn. When he returned, his hair had turned gray at the temples. He refused to speak a word, but the servants noticed the pistol was gone, and his hands were trembling as if he'd seen something he couldn't name. By morning, he ordered that no one enter the cellar again. "Seal it," he said, "with brick and lime." But they never did, because that night they heard her voice, Celeste's voice, coming from beneath the floor. Not pleading, not weeping, singing, a lullaby, the same one she'd used to calm the Devereux children since birth. Eleanor collapsed on the stairs. The doctor said it was grief, but the housekeeper swore it was something else, that Eleanor had felt something pulling her downward when she passed above the cellar door. The smell grew worse in the following days, not of rot, but of jasmine, sickly sweet, unnatural. And when one of the field boys was sent to check the cellar locks, he returned pale, silent, unable to speak. On his shirt were fingerprints, small, dark, wet. They weren't his own. By the end of that week, the master had taken to drinking. He sat at the edge of the veranda every night, whispering to the dark, calling a name the wind refused to carry. Celeste had become a curse the family could not wash off. Even in her absence, she remained, in scent, in sound, in the rhythm of the walls. And sometimes when the house grew still, the floor would rise ever so slightly, as if something below was breathing her back into existence. He waited 3 days before he spoke, not to his wife, not to the priest, but to the housekeeper, a woman too old to frighten easily, too wise to believe in ghosts. He found her in the pantry just before dawn, her hands folded over a rosary. "Marie," he whispered, voice shaking, "I saw her." Marie didn't look up. "We all saw her, sir." "No," he said, gripping her wrist. "Not like this." He told her that when he entered the cellar, the air felt alive, thick, warm, pulsing as if it had lungs. His lantern flickered, but he kept moving, calling Celeste's name. The walls were damp. He heard her humming before he saw her. She was standing barefoot in the far corner, her eyes closed, her body swaying gently, like she was listening to music no one else could hear. Around her feet, small circles drawn in ash, symbols he didn't recognize, looping in endless repetition. He shouted for her to stop. She didn't. When he grabbed her arm, her skin was cold as stone. She opened her eyes then, and he said he saw 2 pupils in each one, both moving independently, as if she could see twice as much as any living soul. He tried to drag her upstairs, but the room changed. The steps vanished. The cellar floor began to rise and fall like a chest breathing. And from the darkness beyond the lantern's reach came whispers, not in English, not in French. Words that sounded like the river itself was speaking through teeth. Then she smiled. "Master," she said, "you built this house on my mother's bones. You thought the land was yours. You thought I was yours. But the blood remembers where it came from." The lantern went out. He said he felt something wet touch his ankle, something that crawled up his leg, gentle at first, then gripping. When light returned, he was alone. But the floor where Celeste had stood was dry, clean, untouched, except for a small pool of water, shaped like a handprint. Marie listened without blinking. "What do you think it means, sir?" she asked. He stared at his hands. They were trembling again. "She's not haunting us," he whispered. She's returning herself. That evening, the master ordered the cellar sealed for good. But as the masons laid brick over the door, they heard something knock, once then twice from the other side. And from somewhere deep beneath the ground, a woman's voice, calm, patient, said, "You can't bury what remembers." It began with the soil. The same soil that had once made the Devereux family rich, black, heavy, fertile, started to change. The field hands were the first to notice. When they dug their shovels in, the earth bled water that wasn't clear but red-brown, like something between clay and blood. The roots of the cane grew twisted, spiraling around themselves, suffocating their own stalks. By the second week, the dogs refused to cross the fields. They'd stand at the edge, hackles raised, staring toward the old well where Celeste had once washed linen. At night, they whimpered, as if hearing footsteps beneath the ground. Eleanor stayed upstairs now, her body frail, her eyes glassy. She hadn't spoken since her child's death. She only pointed toward the window, toward the bayou, as if watching something rise in the distance. The master kept drinking. He stopped shaving. He spent his evenings by the fire, whispering to the air, sometimes calling a name softly. Celeste. Celeste. Like a man begging forgiveness from storm. But the servants knew something larger had woken. The earth around the estate had grown warm. At dawn, steam rose from the ground like breath. The magnolia trees bloomed in winter, the scent thick and nauseating. And near the cellar, sealed now with brick and prayer, the bricks began to sweat. One night, a laborer found small handprints pressed into the mud outside the house. Tiny, childlike, dozens of them, leading from the field straight to the cellar door. He followed them only once. The next morning, they found him floating in the river, eyes open, mouth filled with soil. By then, the priest had refused to come. "This house is past saving," he wrote in his final letter. "Whatever lives beneath, it isn't evil. It's older than evil, and it remembers every nail you hammered into its body." Eleanor's hair began to fall out in clumps. She said the walls whispered her name at night, not in her husband's voice, but in Celeste's. And then the land began to move. The ground around the house swelled like breath drawn deep. Dishes fell from shelves. The mirrors shook. The servants fled to the fields. But even there, the air felt thick, heavy, waiting, because Celeste was no longer just beneath the floor. She was in the soil, in the water, in every root that crawled beneath the Devereux land. The plantation had become a body, and somewhere inside it, the heart had started beating again. No one heard her scream. By the time the morning light filtered through the warped shutters, Eleanor Devereux was simply gone. The servants found her nightgown folded neatly at the edge of her bed, damp, faintly perfumed with jasmine and smoke. Her window was open, though the iron latch had not been broken. Beneath it, in the dew-soaked soil, a single footprint, bare, delicate, and smaller than her own. The master refused to believe she'd left. He searched the house from cellar to attic, calling her name until his throat turned raw. He tore at the sealed bricks where Celeste had once been confined, shouting that his wife had been taken. But when the last brick broke loose, the cellar was empty. Only one thing remained, a lock of hair on the floor, pale as straw, braided with another, darker strand. That night, the rain returned. The housekeeper, Marie, swore she saw Eleanor wandering the gardens just before midnight, barefoot, her white dress trailing behind her like fog. But when lightning illuminated the sky, Marie froze because Eleanor wasn't alone. A second figure walked beside her, hand in hand. Both women were silent, both smiling faintly. one pale as candlelight, the other dark as the soil beneath it. By dawn, the magnolia blossoms had turned black. The master didn't come down for breakfast. When Marie knocked on his door, she found him sitting at his desk, staring at a piece of parchment covered in trembling handwriting. It was a confession, or perhaps an apology. He wrote that he had done something unforgivable years ago. That was when the plantation was first built. The land had belonged to a woman, a freed Creole healer who refused to sell. When she resisted, he took what he wanted, her home, her body, and her life. Her name was Celeste's mother. He buried her where the house now stood. And from that soil, Celeste had been born. The letter ended mid-sentence, ink smeared, as if someone had torn the page from his hands. By evening, the servants had fled. Only Marie remained, muttering prayers in the kitchen, the rosary cutting grooves into her palms. When night came, thunder rolled across the bayou. From her window, Marie saw two shadows moving through the rain, gliding where the river met the field. She couldn't tell which one was Eleanor, but she swore both turned to look at her, and both faces were the same. The invitation was written in the master's own hand. No one knew who he meant it for. The servants had all gone. The priest refused to answer his letters. Even Marie, after weeks of prayer and fasting, had finally left, whispering that she'd rather die in the swamp than spend another night listening to the cellar breathe. Yet that evening, the dining room was lit again. Every candle burning, every glass polished, every plate placed perfectly. The long oak table gleamed under the flickering light. But there were 12 seats, and only one man alive to fill them. He wore his wedding suit, though it no longer fit. His collar hung loose, his eyes hollow, his hands unsteady. Still, he poured the wine. 1 glass for Eleanor, 1 for Celeste, and 10 more for those who were gone, but not forgotten. When the clock struck 7, the air in the room shifted. The candles flared, not with wind, but with breath. He lifted his head slowly. Someone was sitting across from him. Eleanor, her face calm, serene, her hair braided with jasmine. But her eyes were too still, too knowing. Beside her sat another woman. The same smile, darker skin, same eyes. Celeste. They did not speak. The master trembled, clutching his glass. "What do you want from me?" he asked. Celeste leaned forward slightly. What was taken? He looked around the table. The other chairs were no longer empty. Shadows had begun to fill them, the outlines of those buried under his soil. The seamstress, the boy from the field, the preacher's wife. Their forms shimmered, faint but undeniable, their faces etched in grief and patience. The master's lips quivered. "I didn't know. I didn't mean." Celeste smiled. "The land remembers even when you don't." The walls groaned. Plaster cracked. The mirrors along the hall began to rattle. A faint hum filled the room, low, harmonic, almost holy. The master dropped his glass. It shattered, and from the shards leaked not wine, but blood. Eleanor turned her gaze toward him, pitying, distant. "You could have saved one of us," she whispered. "But you chose yourself." Then, one by one, the candles began to extinguish. The last thing he saw was Celeste's hand reaching across the table. Fingers pale at first, then blackened with soil, pressing gently against his chest. And when she whispered, "Breathe," he did. But the air that entered his lungs was not air at all. It was the river. It started with a sound. Not thunder, not wind. Something deeper. A groan from the belly of the land itself. The servants who had fled miles away swore they could still hear it that night. The sound of timbers twisting, foundations crying out like a great animal in its death throes. The Devereux plantation was sinking. The river, swollen from weeks of unseen rain, had broken its banks. Outside, the magnolias shuddered. Their roots tore free from the ground. And in the middle of the floodplain, the white blossoms turned black, one by one, before falling into the water, floating like eyes that refused to close. The last survivor, a stable boy who watched from a cypress tree, said he saw the roof collapse inward. The house didn't crumble. It folded, sinking neatly into the earth like it was being swallowed whole. He said he heard singing, a woman's voice, low, patient and kind. By dawn, only the chimney remained, jutting out from the murky water like a gravestone. Steam rose from the surface, thick with the scent of jasmine. When the townspeople arrived days later, the river was calm again, as if nothing had ever stood there. But they found something caught in the reeds. A single dinner plate, porcelain white, unbroken, with one name etched in the center, Celeste. And beneath it, scratched faintly into the glaze, were 4 words. She took it back. 13 years passed before anyone dared touch that land again. By then, the flood had rewritten the geography. What was once Devereux Estate had become fertile delta, new soil rich with silt and secrets. They said the place was cursed, but curses are just memories that refuse to die. In 1867, a man named Elias Moreau arrived from Baton Rouge with capital, ambition, and a reputation for dismissing superstition. He bought the property at auction for half its worth, calling it Providence Acres. Locals warned him, that ground swallows men. He laughed, said he didn't believe in ghosts, only in profit. The first weeks were easy. He built a new house over the old foundation. The river had calmed, the crops grew fast, and by summer, the land looked alive again. But that was the lie, because beneath the soil, beneath the foundation stones, were timbers from the Devereux dining room, warped and waterlogged, still holding whispers. Workers said they heard sounds underfoot at night, faint clinking like silverware tapping on porcelain. Elias dismissed it as imagination. Then came the scent, jasmine, always at dusk, not from the gardens, but rising from the floorboards. His wife, Mary Ann, began dreaming of a woman standing by the mirror in her dressing room. Tall, calm, eyes too aware. She never moved, never spoke, only watched. The same dream every night. By August, livestock began dying, not from disease but paralysis. Their eyes open, muscles locked. The veterinarian said it was unnatural cessation of function. The same phrase was once used in 1854. Elias noticed that the servants avoided the dining room. They said the table shifted slightly when no one touched it, as if adjusting itself before a meal. And when they left plates on the counter overnight, one would always be missing by morning, only to be found later, spotless, placed neatly at the head of the table. Mary Ann's health declined. She stopped eating, stopped speaking. One evening, she whispered something that chilled her husband to the bone. "She isn't haunting us, Elias. She's waiting." The next morning, the river rose again, not flooding, just enough to touch the porch, like a reminder. That night, Elias walked into the dining room with a lantern and saw what the darkness had been protecting all along. Under the floorboards, through a split in the wood, glimmered porcelain, dozens of plates arranged in perfect rows. The mansion was silent, wrapped in the heavy perfume of magnolia blossoms. Outside, the air hung thick with heat and secrets. Inside, the last candlelight trembled, as if the house itself was holding its breath. It was near midnight when the child began to scream. The sound tore through the stillness, raw and primal, a shriek that made even the dogs outside go quiet. Upstairs, Mrs. Aldridge was found clutching the crib, her hands trembling, her face pale as bone. The baby's skin had begun to turn black, not dark from fever, not bruised, but slowly, unmistakably black, as if the blood beneath had changed its nature. The nurse fainted. The doctor arrived within the hour, but when he touched the child's wrist, he said nothing. He only looked at Delilah, who stood in the doorway, unmoving, her eyes glimmering like oil. They say Mrs. Aldridge begged her to tell the truth, to confess who the father was. But Delilah didn't speak. She only tilted her head slightly and whispered something no one could quite hear. By dawn, the child had stopped breathing. The doctor signed a false death certificate. Mrs. Aldridge was taken away, delirious. The plantation gates were shut, and for weeks, no one entered or left. But the house was changing. The mirrors fogged without heat. The milk soured overnight. Every crucifix on the walls began to tilt one by one, as though the nails could no longer hold them straight. At night, the servants said they saw her, Delilah, walking barefoot through the magnolia grove, carrying something wrapped in white linen. Some claimed it was the child. Others swore it was a doll made from the baby's burial cloth. Whatever it was, she spoke to it softly, in a language no one could name. And then came the fire. It began in the nursery. Flames moved against the wind, climbing the walls, devouring everything painted white. No one ever saw the body of the baby again. But they found something else in the ashes, a small handprint, burned black into the cradle's wood. And it wasn't human-sized. It was smaller, almost demonic. The fire should have ended it. But in Louisiana, nothing that begins in blood ever dies clean. By the time the nursery was rebuilt, the plantation had changed. The soil had turned dark, richer than it should have been, and things began to grow too fast. The vines climbed walls overnight, roots split the stones, and the magnolia trees bloomed out of season, their petals yellowed and heavy with an unfamiliar scent. Mrs. Aldridge had not spoken since that night. She would sit by the window in her white gown, combing her hair, smiling at something no one else could see. Sometimes she whispered, "He's still here," and the servants would flee before dusk. Delilah, however, moved through the estate like a shadow that refused to leave. The master sent word for her to be sold, to be rid of her before more ruin followed. But every trader who came to take her away fell sick before the deal could be struck. One went blind. Another was found in the river, his tongue swollen black. And so she remained. By the second month, the livestock stopped breeding. Calves were born still, foals came twisted, and hens laid eggs that rattled like they were filled with teeth. The overseer tried to burn the stables, said it was witchcraft in the hay, but the fire crawled backward, up his arms, into his throat. They buried what was left of him under the cypress trees. Then came the nights when the laughter started. Children's laughter, faint, echoing through the cotton fields, though no child lived there anymore. The sound would rise just before dawn and fade as the mist rolled in from the bayou. No one slept. No one prayed loud enough. Finally, the master himself broke. He confronted Delilah in the courtyard, demanding to know what she had done. She said nothing for a long while. Then she smiled, that same slow, knowing smile, and whispered, "I didn't bring the fire. You did, when you made me less than human." That night, the magnolia grove caught flame again. But this time, the fire didn't burn upward. It sank into the soil, swallowing roots, crawling deep beneath the house. They said it was the earth itself rejecting them. By the next harvest, the Aldridge name had become a whispered warning across Louisiana. The field stood full, but no one dared touch the cotton. It was said the soil bled when cut, that worms rose to the surface, writhing like veins exposed. Inside the mansion, sickness moved like an unseen hand. The eldest son, Thomas, woke one morning with his skin covered in strange, raised symbols, spirals, lines, marks that seemed drawn from beneath. The doctor said it was a fever, but when the lamps were lowered, those marks glowed faintly, the same shade as the fire that had once consumed the nursery. 2 nights later, Thomas was found dead. His eyes were open, his mouth filled with dirt, as if he had tried to eat the earth itself. Mrs. Aldridge did not weep. She only rocked in her chair and whispered, "The boy just went back to her." The second son, William, began to hear voices. He claimed they called from beneath the magnolia grove, soft, coaxing, the voice of a woman he once saw in his dreams. He would walk barefoot through the mud at midnight, whispering Delilah like a prayer. One morning, the servants found him kneeling by the burnt cradle, humming the same lullaby that had once been sung in the nursery. His tongue was gone. His body was still warm. No one dared bury him. Within weeks, the plantation became a silent cathedral of decay. The mirrors were draped, the portraits turned to face the walls. Even the priest who came to bless the land refused to stay past sunset. He said the air felt aware. Delilah still walked freely among them, untouched, unaged, as if death itself bowed before her. Some swore she no longer cast a shadow. Others said her reflection was not her own. Then, one dawn, she disappeared. No escrim, no straged. Only her chains, neatly folded beside the well. But the curse she left behind was not silence. It was hunger. Every child born to the Aldridge line after that year carried something wrong. Eyes too dark, teeth too sharp, minds that never stayed still. The blood had changed. The family would never be human again. 80 years later, the house still stood. The world outside had changed. Trains screamed through cities, men flew in the sky, and war had burned half the world. But in the heart of Louisiana, Ashwood Hall remained untouched, wrapped in vines and rumor. When Jonathan Aldridge returned in 1934, he came not as a master, but as a man desperate for a legacy. The Depression had emptied his fortune. The old family land was all he had left. He told the townsfolk he would rebuild, restore, and redeem the Aldridge name. They only stared, because everyone in that parish knew what the soil under Ashwood Hall did to blood. Still, Jonathan moved in, alone except for his new bride, Eleanor. She was young, pale, educated in New Orleans, and unaware that she was walking into a graveyard that still breathed. The first night, the air smelled like burnt flowers. Next, she heard knocking beneath the floorboards. By the third, she found a small handprint on the nursery wall, black, smudged, perfectly formed. Jonathan dismissed it all. He didn't believe in curses. He believed in redemption. He hired workers to clear the land, but one by one, they left, refusing to dig near the magnolia grove. They said the roots were too thick, too warm, as if they pulsed with something alive. Then, one of them, a black worker named Silas, came to Jonathan at dusk and said, "You can't build on what's still awake, sir. The earth remembers." Jonathan laughed and offered more pay. Silas never returned the next morning. By the end of that week, Eleanor fell ill. Her fever was strange, not burning, but cold. Her breath misted in the Louisiana heat. She whispered in her sleep, speaking names that had not been uttered in a century. And once, just once, Jonathan heard her whisper Delilah. He searched the estate records, but the name had been erased, torn from every document, blotted out from every ledger. As if the family itself had tried to forget the woman who taught them what power costs. That night, he dreamed of her, standing at the well, barefoot, eyes like burnt honey, whispering, "Your blood remembers me." When he woke, his hands were covered in dirt. Eleanor's illness defied medicine. Her skin grew pale as ash, her veins dark as ink. The doctor from Baton Rouge said it was a rare blood infection, but he couldn't explain why her eyes had begun to change color. A deep golden hue, reflective in the candlelight like those of a wild cat. Jonathan tried everything: holy water, quinine, even the prayers his grandmother used to whisper in the old Aldrich chapel. But Eleanor only grew quieter. Sometimes she would sit in front of a nursery door for hours, humming that same forgotten tune, the lullaby Delilah once sang to her dead child. He didn't know how she knew it. One night, as thunder rolled in from the swamps, he found her standing barefoot in the magnolia grove, her white gown streaked with mud. The roots had risen from the soil like skeletal hands, and she was pressing her palms against the largest tree, whispering. Jonathan called to her, but she didn't turn. When he touched her shoulder, she turned slowly and smiled. Her voice wasn't hers anymore. It was lower, older. "Do you know how long I waited for your blood to come home?" she said. The next morning, she remembered nothing. But the signs were everywhere. What he found instead was a small bundle wrapped in white linen, perfectly preserved. Inside it, black ashes and a silver locket, engraved with a single name: Delilah. The nights grew longer after Jonathan unearthed the locket. The moment he touched it, something in the air shifted, a low vibration, like the hum of 1,000 unseen wings. Even the cicadas went silent. When he brought it back to the house, every clock stopped at the same time, 3:03 a.m. Eleanor no longer slept. She spoke in whispers, half in dreams, half in tongues no one living should know. Her belly grew faster than nature allowed, swelling like the moon with each passing day. Sometimes, when she stood near the window, her skin seemed to pulse, as if something inside was pressing outward, trying to remember how to breathe. Jonathan began keeping the locket locked away in his study. But some mornings, it was gone, and he would find it lying on Eleanor's pillow. Once, he woke to the sound of it clicking open by itself. Inside was no portrait, only a fragment of blackened hair, fused to the metal. And then the heartbeat started. It wasn't Eleanor's. It was deeper, louder. You could hear it in the walls, in the floorboards, in the soil. The servants left one by one. They said the house had begun to breathe. Curtains moved with no wind. Footsteps echoed in empty corridors. And the mirrors, once draped in white, began to show reflections that didn't belong to anyone in the room. One night, Jonathan pressed his ear against Eleanor's stomach and heard something whisper back. A woman's voice, low, patient, eternal. The child was promised. He tore open the old family Bible, looking for meaning, flipping through brittle pages until one slipped free. A note, written by his great-grandmother in trembling ink. The one who bore the fire said she would return in another womb, not as flesh, but as memory. That night, Eleanor began bleeding. The doctor came, but when he touched her wrist, his hand recoiled as if burned. The blood on her skin shimmered like oil, alive with movement. And then, from the cradle in the nursery, empty for generations, came a soft, rhythmic sound, rocking, back and forth, back and forth. Eleanor screamed. The candles blew out, and through the darkness, Jonathan saw two golden eyes staring back at him from inside the cradle, glowing like molten honey, fixed on him with recognition. It wasn't Delilah reborn. It was something older, something that had used her. The storm came first. It rolled in from the bayou like a living thing, swallowing the moon, drowning the world in thunder. The walls of Ashwood Hall groaned, the windows trembled, and somewhere deep inside the house, the cradle began to rock again. Eleanor was already in labor when the lightning struck the magnolia grove. The air turned to iron. The smell of blood filled every room. Jonathan tried to call the doctor, but the phone lines hissed. Not dead, but alive, whispering his name through static. He carried her to the old nursery, the same room that had burned a century ago. The walls still bore faint scorch marks, like veins of memory. Eleanor clutched his arm, her fingernails drawing blood. "She's coming," she gasped. "She's waited long enough." He told her to breathe, but it wasn't her breathing he heard. It was another's, low, slow inside the house. The cradle began to creak, moving with the rhythm of her contractions. The windows burst open, wind, rain, ash, and the scent of magnolia blossoms flooding in. And then the power went out. The only light came from the fireplace, and within that trembling orange glow, Jonathan saw something he could never forget. Eleanor's belly is moving not like a woman in pain, but like something crawling beneath her skin. The doctor arrived just as the screaming stopped. He froze in the doorway. Jonathan was holding his wife, but she was no longer speaking. Her eyes were open, glowing faintly gold, and her lips were moving, mouthing words that weren't hers. The doctor tried to help, but his hands shook too violently. There was one final push, one final breath, and the child was born. But it didn't cry. It only opened its eyes. The room fell silent. The storm outside stopped mid-thunder, and from a nursery floor came a sound, with splitting, boards cracking as the house itself exhaled. Jonathan stared at the newborn. Its skin was pale, too pale. Its eyes were golden, the same as Delilah's. Around its neck hung a tiny chain, and from it, the silver locket he had buried days ago. He whispered, "What are you?" The baby smiled, and somewhere beneath the floor, in the deep belly of Ashwood Hall, something began to move, slowly, rhythmically, like a buried heart remembering how to beat again. Jonathan didn't sleep for 3 days. He locked the nursery door and buried the key beneath the hearth. The baby made no sound, no cry, no breath. Only the faint creak of wood whenever he passed by the door, as though it rocked itself in the cradle. He tried to convince himself it was madness. But the servants had fled, the doctor never returned, and Eleanor, she lay cold in her bed, her face frozen in a half-smile. The child had taken her warmth, her life, her soul. On the third night, Jonathan carried the newborn outside, down into the magnolia grove where Delilah's well still stood, half collapsed and covered in moss. The wind was dead. Even the frogs had gone silent. He held the baby above the darkness of the well and whispered, "Whatever you are, you end here." But before he could drop it, the ground shuddered. The roots of the magnolia trees twisted upward, curling around his legs, his arms, holding him still. From the earth rose that same scent again, burnt flowers and something sweet like rotting honey. And then the baby laughed. It was soft, delicate, the sound of something ancient pretending to be innocent. The locket around its neck flickered with light, pulsing in rhythm with Jonathan's heartbeat. A voice came from the soil, from beneath him, a voice both woman and whisper. "You think the curse was in me?" "No, Jonathan. It was in you. It always was." The ground split open. Beneath the roots, he saw bones, hundreds of them, pale as wax, arranged in a spiral leading down into the earth. Faces, twisted in pain, preserved in the soil like fossils of suffering. The history of his family. He screamed, and threw the locket into the well. The child stopped laughing. The roots loosened. For a moment, it was quiet. But when he looked down at the baby again, it was gone. Only the linen cloth remained, soaked with black soil. He stumbled back toward the mansion, delirious. As he reached the steps, he saw it. The same small figure standing in the doorway. The baby walking, holding the locket, watching him. The next morning, Ashwood Hall stood empty again. The housekeeper who arrived weeks later found Jonathan's boots at the edge of the well, and beside them, a trail of tiny footprints leading back to the house. They said the soil never grew anything there again. Not cotton, not flowers, only magnolia trees with roots that bled when cut. By the summer of 1936, the town of St. Mireille began to notice strange births. Infants are born silent, eyes open, irises tinted with a faint, metallic gold that gleamed even in the dark. Doctors called it a pigmentation anomaly. Midwives called it what their grandmothers had whispered for generations, the Aldridge mark. No one spoke the name Ashwood Hall anymore. The mansion was left to rot, swallowed by vines and silence. But the wind that moved through its broken windows carried whispers down the valley, lullabies without singers, prayers without gods. Soon after, livestock began dying. Milk turned bitter overnight. Wells filled with the scent of magnolia, even when no trees grew nearby. The sheriff claimed it was the swamp gases, but when he went to inspect the grove, he came back pale and shaking, refusing to speak again. He lasted 3 days before hanging himself. The town preacher gathered the congregation for a midnight sermon. He thundered about sin, about bloodlines, about the wages of lust and rebellion. But halfway through, his voice broke, and he began to laugh. Not a man's laugh, a woman's. Someone swore they saw gold flicker in his pupils before the candles went out. By the following spring, 6 more women were pregnant, all without husbands. They swore they'd never been touched. Their bellies grew quickly, and their dreams turned black. They saw a barefoot woman in white walking through their fields, whispering, "Your blood remembers me." When the first of the babies came, it was born still, but smiling. The coroner fainted when he realized the child's umbilical cord wasn't attached to its body, but to something that looked like root tissue. The town began to empty. Families fled north, abandoning homes, churches, and graves. Yet every road that led away passed near the Magnolia Grove, and travelers swore that at night, something walked beside their wagons, humming softly. By 1938, St. Mireille was gone. No one remained, but the forest grew thick where it once stood. Magnolias bloomed where the church had burned, and in the swamp water, if you looked closely, you could see the reflection of a woman holding a child, both with eyes of gold. They say she waits, not for revenge, but for recognition, because every few decades, another child is born with those same eyes, no matter where the Aldridge blood is spread. In 1971, a historian named Dr. Michael Torrance moved to Baton Rouge to research the early plantation economies of southern Louisiana. He was a rational man, skeptical of folklore, hostile to superstition. But one evening, while cataloging his state ledger for the state archives, he came across a crate marked property of Aldridge Estate, restricted by court order, 1856. It shouldn't have been there. The label was yellowed and nearly unreadable, sealed with a crimson wax emblem no one in the department could identify. The box wasn't listed in any record. It had simply appeared. Inside were 6 journals, bound in rotted leather, written in a precise, obsessive hand. The first was dated 1849, the last 1854. The name on the inside cover, Jonathan Aldrich. At first, Torrance assumed he'd found a routine plantation diary, the tedious economics of land, crop, and labor. But by the third page, he realized he was reading something else entirely. Jonathan wrote about a woman he called the property that speaks. He described her voice as melodic, her mind frighteningly organized. He detailed the slow erosion of the men around her, how their dreams changed, how their wills weakened, how their wives began to hear music where none played. And then, the last entry scrawled in a trembling hand. She has learned to write in my script. She has begun signing my name. She moves through my house as though we're built for her hands. The magnolias bloom when she walks. I no longer know which voice is mine. The page was stained with something darker than ink. Torrance closed the journal and laughed nervously. Surely this was fiction, some feverish diary written by a delusional man. But as he reached for the second volume, a faint scent of magnolia filled the air. He froze. The archives had no windows, no flowers, no reason for that scent. He checked the temperature. It had dropped nearly 10 degrees in under a minute. That night, he took the journals home against protocol. He couldn't sleep. The words called to him. Almost alive, pulsing with the rhythm of something that had waited more than a century to be read again. By dawn, he made a decision. He would visit the ruins of Ashwood Hall himself. 3 days later, his car was found abandoned beside the Bayou Road. The keys are still in the ignition. On the passenger seat, Jonathan Aldrich's final journal, open to a single line underlined 3 times. The woman they buried in chains was never meant to die, only to wait. They called it the root cellar, but to the family, it was something far older. A chamber of stone beneath the farmhouse, damp, red, and pulsating with breath. The walls weren't just stone. They were alive. Veins ran through them, faintly glowing when touched. The air tasted metallic, like a wound refusing to close. The last Harlow's son, thin, trembling, his eyes gone glassy, stood before that pulsing wall. His mother's journal had led him here, page after page speaking of atonement, of feeding the mouth that birthed them. He read the final entry. To starve it is to let it rise. To feed it is to be forgiven. And as he tore open his palm with the kitchen knife, pressing it to the living wall, it shuddered. The house above groaned. Dust fell from the rafters, and deep beneath the floorboards, something whispered his name. Not from outside, but from inside his own blood. The cellar began to hum, and the faint heartbeat grew louder, syncing with his own. He realized then what the elders had meant. The Harlow curse wasn't a disease. It was a covenant, one sealed by generations of blood willingly spilled. In the flicker of his lantern, the wall opened, revealing a mouth lined not with teeth, but with bone fragments, each one carved into a human name. One of them bore his. He screamed, but the cellar swallowed the sound whole. Outside, the wind carried a strange new rhythm, the echo of 2 hearts beating as one. When dawn came, the town found the farmhouse half swallowed by the earth. Its roof tilted, windows buried, soil packed into the parlor like a coffin filled too soon. The air reeked of iron and wet clay. Birds refused to land on the fences. Even the dogs howled, facing away from the house. Sheriff Alden, who had lived his entire life in those valleys, said it looked as if the land itself had tried to eat the Harlow property. And he wasn't wrong. Every generation, the earth had been fed, a ritual masked as madness, sealed beneath family silence. But this time, it wasn't enough. Something had awakened, something that I remembered. When they finally pried open the cellar door, they didn't find the boy. They found only roots. Long, pale, vein-like roots wrapped around the stone like muscle and marrow. The roots had absorbed what once was flesh. Even the shape of fingers pressing outward could still be seen beneath the surface, as if frozen mid-scream. The sheriff's men swore they heard breathing below the dirt. And one of them, the youngest deputy, said he heard a heartbeat, slow and patient, syncing with his own pulse until he staggered back, clutching his chest. Before night fell, the sheriff ordered the entire property sealed and buried again under lime and gravel. He said, if it wanted to rise, let the ground choke on it. But by the next sunrise, the earth had split open again. A single vine had pushed through the soil, white, wet, pulsing, and coiled toward the morning light like something tasting the air for the first time. It wasn't just remembering anymore. It was hungry. For years after the farmhouse sank, no one dared step near the old Harlow land. The county mapped it as unstable terrain, fenced it off, and let the forest reclaim it. But some nights, when the fog crept down from the hills, travelers said they could see the outline of a house that wasn't there. Lanterns burning behind windows swallowed long ago. Time passed. The story faded. Families moved on, but the bloodline didn't. In 1974, a highway expansion crew unearthed the old property while clearing soil for the new road. Beneath the gravel, they found bone growths twisted together like roots, too many to belong to a single person. And when one worker tried to snap off a piece as a souvenir, it bled. Within days, he vanished from sight. His co-workers said he'd gone quiet, then wandered into the woods at night. Search teams found only his boots, buried ankle-deep in wet earth, like something had pulled him downward, not away. The state sealed the dig again. The road was rerouted, and the name Harlow was erased from the county records, as if it had never belonged to anyone. But every few decades, when the ground shakes in that valley, the locals whisper the same thing, that the Harlows are still alive somewhere beneath the soil, not breathing, not rotting, just waiting, part of a body larger than the land itself. And if you walk the old fence line on a quiet night, you might hear it too, a slow, wet heartbeat pulsing beneath your feet. The earth doesn't forget what it was fed. It only waits until it's hungry again.